if it's recording. Alright, well, I think we're recording now. So, welcome everyone to another episode of Meta Musings. And as always, I'm here with Sotere. How are you doing now, Sotere?
Doing wonderful, doing wonderful. Had some good games today. Got to live blog with my best of buds.
Yep, Sotere's, of course, talking about the NA Regional going on at PAX, and there were some exciting games, especially Game 2 with Legion and CLG, so some good games today. And we're actually going to reference these games today later on, so keep that in mind. But first, as always, we're going to start out with our unconventional support, and as always, you can tell who we're going to be talking about by looking at the champion in the middle of the screen.
You can indeed. No surprises on this show, except what we're going to talk about later. Today, the unusual support champion is Darius, and we actually talked about him a little bit last week, in the sense that I think Brian was saying that, you know, a lot of the new champions are so strong, you can put them in the support role, Nautilus, Darius, so on and so forth, but there's something that both Darius and Nautilus have in common that allows them to be in the support role, and that's good base numbers, good, crowd control ability. So what Darius brings to the table is a great laning phase. I mean, right now if you put him top lane, there are very few matchups he loses up there, and most of them he absolutely dominates because he has a great mixture of physical damage, magic damage, and true damage once he gets his ultimate up, and of course he'll normally have Ignite to augment that as well. But if you put him in the bottom lane, he has Apprehend, and that is a great tool to get people in range of you. He has this W also that will slow people down, and he is also doing significant amounts of damage, more so than just about any other support in the bottom lane. Now, of course, he does fall off because he is that melee range champion. He doesn't really have great escapes, and we've kind of already gone over his whole kit insofar as CC is concerned. But when you get into that late game, he still has the potential of doing a lot of damage, chaining together kills. Now, there is a train of thought that would be like, oh, well, you totally don't want your support to be picking up kills. And you have a couple options for this. One, you can decide, okay, well, we're not going to let him get kills. We'll just let him use his ultimate once on a 5 hemorrhage stack person, do a lot of true damage to them. But I mean, if you don't mind him getting kills, then he can, potentially do a lot of true damage to multiple people throughout the fights. Yes, he might soak up a lot of those kills. That might be bad. But if you have a support that is, suddenly has equivalent amounts of gold to everyone else on the team, suddenly you're almost playing like a 5-on-4, because generally supports are building GP10 items, and it takes 30-35 minutes into the game to get them any real sort of items underneath their belt. So if he does take the kills, I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people make out, especially since supports buy very essential items. They'll buy an Aegis, they'll buy the Oracles, they'll buy the Wards, and you always need those things to be available on your team. And it doesn't matter whether your jungle picks them up or your support picks them up. So he has the potential to really wreak havoc in the late game, as well as having a really dominating early game laning presence. So he is our unusual support. I don't know if there might be any more weaknesses that you might see to that, Zero.
I mean, basically, the items are the real big issue because he really likes having items. And I mean, one question you might have is, why not pick somebody like Blitzcrank instead? Because it seems like Blitz offers basically the same thing, except his pull is better, and he has a knockup instead of a slow. And he has like a half a second, I think, silence with his ultimate. So I mean, it seems Blitzcrank does fill basically everything that Darius does, except better. Well, except for maybe, the true damage, but it seems like Blitzcrank, for example, offers more utility than Darius, so why would you pick Darius over some other more conventional supports?
Well, one, Blitzcrank has a tendency to be banned. Two, Blitzcrank has a half a second silence. Darius has a 40-second silence, and his silence is Noxian Guillotine. When he actually kills people, they cannot cast any spells for a good long while.
Well, unless it's a Karthus. That's not an actual silence, then.
Okay, that's true. Unless it's Karthus. But actually, if you silence Karthus and kill him, I don't think it carries through. So, just to be fair. Regardless, he brings more dueling potential. Blitzcrank will be banned on occasion. And Apprehend is certainly not as good as Pull, but people won't be as worried about apprehend. People don't tend to get worried about being pulled through walls when you're playing Darius, but they still can be. Yes, the range is short. It's around 550 as opposed to probably about 800 from Blitzcrank. 750. 750, 800. Somewhere around there for Blitzcrank. I'm not entirely sure.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's certainly a shorter range, but it's harder to miss because it's conal. So you're generally only missing if they run too far out of the way, and it does pull people out of over the walls, and people don't expect it quite as much. When there's a Darius, for instance, and you're doing and they're protecting Baron Pit, they'll run right up to the next to the wall and forget, oh, I can still be pulled over. Whereas everyone's pretty used to being pulled over by Blitzcrank. We'll be very, very careful about that. So he has some of the surprise factor going for you, but mainly I believe he has better dueling capabilities as a support, and you might say, oh, he needs those items, but actually, he does so much true damage, without said items. As soon as he hits 6, and he does a significant amounts of damage before that. I mean, when you send him top lane, most people still run like Philo, Stone, Heart of Gold first off on him, because he's so strong that he can beat other top laners who are very, very strong opponents with only GP10 items. If you put Doran's Blades on him, Hex Drinker, he becomes that much stronger. Phage especially is a really great item, but he doesn't necessarily need those, because what happens is at level 6 he suddenly does 500 true damage with Noxian Guillotine. If he has Ignite, that's another 250, and we're going against the bottom lane, whether you have Ignite or your AD carry has Ignite, that is just a lot of true damage to sustain through, and not to mention all the ancillary damage, the magic damage from Hemorrhage, and the Decimate damage, and all sorts of physical damage that he's also putting down. And his slow is pretty good at slowing people. It's pretty good at keeping people right next to you. So that's another consideration. Blitzcrank very good at sticking to people too, but he has the pull, the knockup, and then people run at regular speed generally. And I would prefer the knock-up over said slow, but the slow is nothing to sneeze at either.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that ultimate at level 6, especially if you have a champion, an AD carry with a lot of burst damage, like for example Ezreal or Graves or Corki, you can have the opportunity to really get an apprehend and then just burst somebody down once he hits 6 with all that damage, with all that true damage and the burst from the AD carry. So it can really help your AD carry pick up some kills there too. Something that might not be possible with another champion that doesn't have another support champion that doesn't quite have that same burst. So not quite the usual support we have here. I mean, last time we had Jarvan, who does benefit the AD carry in those ways, but really Darius is there to because of his high base numbers and because of his CC. So really, it's what he's bringing to the team isn't directly aiding, say, an AD carry or another carry, but he's just trying to be there with. He's just a champion that can work well without the for example, Doran's Blades or Phage or whatever you mentioned, and you did mention that he can work well with those GP10 items. So even in the top lane, so I mean, it could work in the bot lane as a support as well. So just somebody who can bring a lot of damage without items and can offer CC and utility to the team as well. So not you might get flamed at or yelled at if you try to pick Darius support, but so I mean you might want to try to duo with somebody or play with people but not the it's a viable, or I don't know about viable, but it's
it is viable. I've actually played against him the last couple of days.
Okay.
It was essentially actually the other team was trolling, and this guy kept on picking Darius support because he didn't want to play support, he wanted to play top lane, but I ended up going against it. It was actually very, very scary. And another thing I was thinking about it, another thing he has over Blitzcrank is Apprehend can pull multiple people in, and Decimate will then land on multiple people and add the hemorrhage proc to multiple people. So he does, I think, a little bit more AoE damage, has the AoE presence to pull people in, because that is kind of a not a huge issue with Blitzcrank, but it comes to a point where if you're camping a brush and two people are running at you, for instance, you're always who do I pull? And there always tends to be one person you want to pull and one person you don't want to pull, and you always pull the one you don't want to pull. For instance, Ezreal, or Ezreal because he can get away so easy, Tristana because she can get away so easy, or you pull someone incredibly tanky like Taric, and suddenly you pulled the Taric, but their AD carry is still in the back lines, and now all hell is raining down on you. Well, with Darius, you have like the dual fear factor where you're pulling both people in at the same time, damaging them both at the same time, and so you'll see like double flashes from them or whatever they need to do essentially. But there's not as much counterplay because they'll be more afraid essentially of that AoE damage, of the fact that they're both being targeted. Whereas as Blitzcrank, you can be left kind of out in the distance. You can be left for dead by your AD carry. If you pull someone in, your AD carry is like, I don't really like that pull. I'm a little bit too far away. I don't want to use Quick Draw or Valkyrie to get in there, or Arcane Shift. I'd rather just stay back here and farm. And suddenly you as Blitzcrank are like, oh, I'm down to a quarter health, or maybe I'm dead. Darius is probably not going to have the same issues because your AD carry will most likely follow up with you, and the other team will be too afraid to really stick in that pocket. They'll both be forced to try to get out of there ASAP. So I think he is viable. I don't know that we'll be seeing it anytime soon, professionally in the competitive scene, but he certainly can be used.
Yeah, and if we aren't here to challenge the scene, then we really have no use at all. So Darius support, that is Darius support for you. Now I think we're going to move on to the main part of the show, in which we are going to talk about lane switching. And it's something that's been going on for a while. It's not exactly a new way to change the meta, but I think we thought it would be a good idea to talk about it because really, if you want to do lane switching, there are some main things you have to consider first. I think I narrowed it down to 3 main topics. One is why do you want to do the lane switch? Another is what lanes do you want to switch? And the last is what champions do you want to lane switch with? So let's start with the first one. What was the first one again? Why do you want to lane switch?
Why do you want to lane switch?
Yes.
You like list them in very nice order, and then like, what did I just say? You're just making sure we're all listening. I'm listening.
It's like a Dora the Explorer kind of thing, What did I just say? Anyway, so why do you want to lane switch? So why might we want to do a lane switch?
Well, in general, you lane switch to get an advantage over your opponents. Why would you want an advantage over them? Well, in most cases, it's because they'll pick a top that counters your top, or is much more aggressive than your top, or doesn't have the capability to 2v1, whereas your top might have that capability. We've seen this in past tournaments with Janna being an AP top, because she can farm solo, or like AP bottom rather, farm against 2 people from very safe distances using Howling Gale. And more frequently we'll see Yorick do it. We saw SK use Gangplank and do it all the time because he kept on getting matched up against Renekton's and lots of other people that Gangplank quite frankly isn't going to win the lane against. But instead they decide, okay, well, we're going to put him 1v2 because he at least has parlay. He can farm from range. We're going to give him teleport, so on and so forth. We're going to give him some advantages so that he can take make a good situation out of a bad situation. They counterpicked you, or they have a more aggressive top laner that's essentially going to force you out of lane. Well, suddenly you swap the lanes up, and now in a lot of cases the bruisers who win matchups tend to have less range than the bruisers who will lose those 1v1 matchups, and that's why they lose, because they don't have the range. They can't go toe to toe like Gangplank, for instance. And so that is essentially why you'd want to do it. Just make a matchup more favorable to you.
So here's a question though. Is it better to, or I guess not better, when would you want to do, or what would be the basic strategy when you're doing lane switch? Because it seems like you might want to just zone out, as the 2v1 lane, to zone out the enemy bruiser and prevent them from getting CS. But we saw, I think yesterday it was, that TSM had a slightly different strategy.
Yeah, and I think it's a strategy they picked up from Azubu Blaze during I think that was the MLG Summer Arena games, where they, kind of got smoked 5-0 by Azubu Blaze. And, there were a lot of lane swaps in that game, but historically the reason, or the way you, most ideally play out the lane swap is you zone them out for a couple of minion waves, then it gets pushed to the tower, and you try to zone them out as best you can while they're underneath the turret as well. But the way that we saw it coming from Azubu Blaze and the way we saw it from TSM yesterday was not so much a zoning out. Of course, that's still a function of it. You don't want to just allow them to get in there, get last hits, get experience, but a zoning out into a very aggressive push strategy.
Yep. So actually, we have. I don't know if I think I lost you for a second there, but I think we have a video of TSM's aggressive push strategy and their lane switch from yesterday. So let me try to bring up that video really quick. See if I can do it right here. One second. Okay.
Yeah.
So. Sotere's in that corner right there. You can stay there. It's covering up a couple of stuff.
I'm not going to block anything. I don't think I'll block
yeah.
anything too important.
So we have Rivington commentating on this. I want to drop him a little bit low so we can do a little bit of our own commentary. But we have the 2v1 lane up here. We have TSM with Chaos and Special up top, and Odd1 comes in for a gank, diving that turret, and they get the kill. So I'm going to pause right here. So they got that early first blood kill with Chaos and Special going up top with that lane switch. So Jace, that is Darius on Jace, went bottom to handle the AD carry and support from MME, while TSM sent Special and Chaos top. And Odd1 ganks top, they get that first blood. And now a lot of times what teams will do is they'll clear waves, push the tower, and let the tower kill all these minions so that the Bruiser misses out on a lot of last hits. But let's see what TSM does in this case. So they are going to take down a lot of turrets. I think Rivington also actually comments on how he expected them to just take the turret down to half health, but that is not what they do. They decide to actually take it all the way down, and yep, they're going to finish off that turret and then back off. So Mundo came to help out a little bit, but he was, it was a 3v1, so he didn't want to go in there. And they took that turret down very quickly. So if you look at the time, it's not even 4 minutes yet. They've already taken down top turret with that lane switch, and they have first blood. They have a turret, and they're up about 1.6k in gold. So I mean, this is really one of those really early turrets to help push, and we're trying to take advantage of an early lead to snowball to victory.
Right, and a great thing they did there is, as we mentioned before the video went on, they zoned out the Kayle. Kayle incidentally took Q as opposed to E, which is a rather unusual, beginning skill to take. But either way, I don't think that would have changed what happened. And they were level 1 when they got ganked, because they got zoned out of essentially 2 waves. And then as soon as the wave was getting pushed to the tower, TSM clearly had this plan from beforehand. Okay, we're going to zone them out. We're going to let the minion wave push to the tower. We're going to get a gank coming in. And so Odd1 came in. He wasn't really even needed. I mean, I think he did do a little bit of damage, but I'm pretty sure Kayle was going to die regardless. But they certainly secured it. And then they decided to push to the tower, and, it was great in the sense that, okay, they got a kill. They got a tower. That's a really big bonus. And teams that generally get ahead stay ahead. That's the general rule in League of Legends. But where might this have gone wrong for them, Brian?
Well, main thing is after that, Kayle was able to freeze the lane. So it froze on MME's side, so that really TSM really couldn't do anything to deny Kayle anymore because it was frozen and it was on their side, so that it would be really risky to extend that far for TSM. So actually what happened was, after this, TSM sent Chaos and Special bot, so basically sending them back to the normal lanes, and really Kayle was able to kind of come back from this, just farming up by freezing the lane, and TSM didn't really capitalize on the lane switch as much as they might have been able to if they had just chosen to zone out the Kayle.
Right, because when they took down that turret, there was still greater than a regular minion wave of minions that were still beating on the turret because they did such a great job at killing said turret. There were still minions that were then pushing towards the base. There was another minion wave coming in behind it. So essentially, Kayle was able to freeze that lane for, it seemed like forever in the game. We were watching, we're like, oh, Kayle's still at her turret. Oh, Kayle's still at her turret. And 10 minutes later, we hear another comment from Rivington III where, oh, Kayle, tracked the minions through the forest so that she could continue freezing it at the turret. So it was really just a frozen wave forever. And we've been talking, how do you really make early turrets pay off? And in this case, I don't think TSM did make it pay off because Kale essentially caught up, was farming, got to farm really well, whereas, they swapped of the lanes, which would have meant Darius on Jace would have had to go back up top, but he didn't want to farm, and there's a danger in farming. Of course, you can freeze the lane back at your turret, but once, you've kind of given away that advantage, that capacity to freeze over there, then it's really hard to get it back with any sort of reasonable amount of time. And he would actually have to put multiple wards at their blue, at Baron essentially, to make sure that they weren't going to gank him in any sort of way, because he would have to farm very far up.
Yeah, but that's not to say that TSM made the wrong decision here, though, because despite how it turned out, their basic strategy was, we're going to push down towers early, we're going to try to snowball early off an early lead, and that's what they did. They got an excellent start. They got the first blood. After that dive, they got the tower, and really that helped them to get to that early lead. Now, just because they weren't able to capitalize on it as much as they could have, doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do. So really, it was just a different way of using that lane switch than is usual. They use that lane switch to get that early turret, to get that early lead that way. They might not have been able to capitalize, but it was a legitimate strategy, and eventually they did win, so it's not like it hurt them too much in the long run. But yeah, so it was a good way for them to get that lead.
Yeah, I think the concern is, at some point, Kale became more farmed than Jace did, and really that's kind of the matchup, top versus top, even though there was a lot of lane swapping, eventually Jace was back up top, and Jace wasn't really able to go around and be a major presence in the other lanes. And I think what you have to do is, once you take that top lane, if they're going to freeze it, you really have to have someone that can take advantage of, roaming around. And Jace probably can, but just wasn't used to the same effect, and they didn't really have any plans to go, push full bore. Whereas today, we actually saw CLG playing against Legion, and in their first 2 games, they really employed really unique push strats, pulling out promote and multiple teleports. I believe 3 teleports each time. Might have been only 2 the second time. I don't quite remember. But anyways, multiple teleports each game and promote. And the first game was really masterful in the sense that, they sent 2 people middle, and then they just, rotated the number advantage around to continue taking down turrets all throughout the course of the game.
Yeah, and that's actually a good transition into the next part, which I remember this time, is which lanes do you want to switch. And top and bottom are, the typical lane swap, because you really want that 2v1 matchup against the enemy bruiser, and you typically pick a bruiser or, for example, AP Janna, who can deal with a 2v1 matchup very well. Now, what CLG did today, which we don't have a video of because it's not up yet, but what they did today was send Double Lift and Chowster mid, and really they used that and they actually took Promote mid as well. So they had, in the first game, they had a very good execution of a push strategy, and they were able to take early turrets, they were able to just snowball early and really walk all over Legion in that game, because they were able to utilize that push strategy very well, using their teleports and, to great effect.
Yeah, and it was really amazing and impressive what they did. It didn't turn out so well the second game, but in the first game, they take Sever and Sona, put them in middle, and they really just did an all-out push. And they were going up against Desire, were really able to kind of counter her, do a lot of damage to her. Sever at one point picked up, a kill against them.
Okay, it seems like Sotere's Sotere, it seems like
Yeah.
your sound is going out a little bit.
Happily honest, Malachi got caught, killed G.
So, can you repeat what you said, like the last 5 seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. So they did a really good job. Am I back with you?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I can see myself just fine. But they were kind of aided by the fact that Malachi tried to counter jungle, got caught by Mundo, ended up giving up a kill, and that relieved a lot of pressure on all the lanes and on the jungle, obviously. and mid lane was able to go to town. They're like, oh, well, the opposing jungler is dead. They don't have double buffs. I think actually the double buffs might have gone to Sona, who was actually in the mid lane as well. But they really furiously pushed. They promoted early on, and they were just pushing, pushing, pushing to the turret. And it worked out great, but there were a number of factors that helped it work out great. A danger of doing this in the middle is tends to be easy to gank because you can gank from both sides. But what they managed to do, CLG that is there were a couple ganks that were attempted by Lotta Mortis to come in the middle, but suddenly that only makes it a 2v2. But in addition to that, CLG actually managed to have Hotshot GG around every time on Mundo. Whenever there was a gank, they had a ward, they saw it, they acted perfectly. They didn't act like they knew there was a ward there at all, so they just went on their business as usual. Hotshot had enough time to come over, and then suddenly it was a 3-on-2 in middle, and things just really, got out of control for Legion at that point. But a masterful thing they did was really, transition, and the whole team was focused on this split pushing as opposed to TSM, who was, they seemed like they had a really great strategy. Let's take this really early turret. But after that point, they didn't really have, where are we going to go from here?
Yeah, and it might be said that if you want to do that really early turret strategy, mid turret is a riskier proposition, but it's more beneficial to your team as it really opens up the jungle more for your team if you're able to take that mid turret early. So CLG went for the lane switch mid, and it worked out well for them, at least in the first game. I think it was the second game where they tried to do the lane switch, but a blitzcrank on Legion meant that the TF couldn't really deal with a 2v1 lane, so they switched back to a normal lane. But
Right.
yeah, so at least in game one, they did this very well. They lane switched mid with the strategy of pushing hard and pushing early so that they can develop an early lead so that they can snowball to win the game. And it was great execution and a great lane switch by them. So it's a situation where you might want to do a lane switch to the mid. I think Sotere mentioned earlier when we first started talking about this how you really might want to do that lane switch of top and bottom when you want to zone out the bruisers. So TSM went with the pushing early with the top and bottom switch, but usually what you see is you have a lane switch top and bottom when you want to zone out the bruiser, and you have a lane switch for mid when you want to really push and take down turrets quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So the last part we should talk about is champions. Who is good for the lane switching, both in both 2v1 lanes, basically.
Who is good? I'm not certain which direction your question is coming from. Who is good to face off 1v2, or who is good for the 2v1?
Well, both basically. If you know you're gonna do a lane switch, who should you have for your AD carry and support, or who should you have for your bruiser slash? I mentioned AP Janna earlier, but why and who and why would you want these champions?
Yeah. Well, I think as you mentioned, Legion had that Blitzcrank in bottom. And I believe it was Blitzcrank and Corki probably,
yes,
or Blitzcrank Great. It was Corki probably. And that is a lane you don't want to go against 1v2. Essentially, you don't want to go against very, very aggressive lanes. You can get away with it if they're playing Janna, if they're playing Soraka to a kind of a lesser extent. If they're playing Soraka, you're not really in danger of being killed very early on, but you will be out sustained, of course. But those two people, like kind of the standard supports, are okay people to play against it. But if they pick up a Blitzcrank or a Leona or a Taric, you're suddenly at very great risk of being dived or doven or dived.
Divin.
You're going to get tower dived very early on in the game because Taric and Blitzcrank can tank a couple of hits from the turret. They're not going to be worried about going in there, and then they have hard CC to ensure that a kill is secured. So those are people you don't want to do it against. Lulu is kind of suspicious in the sense that doesn't have the same amount of burst damage, but she can really help people push. So if your goal is pushing, then you can really use that. And Sona likewise really has great pushing and sustain capabilities and doesn't give up quite as much as Janna or Soraka in the burst department. She still affords a lot more burst and a lot more poke than either of them do.
Yeah, CLG actually I want to mention went with Sivir Sona today in that lane switch to the mid because they really wanted the pushing power of Sona and Sivir from that combination. So that's why they chose those champions. But go on.
Yeah, it's the push and the poke combination from Sona, and actually forced out a ban in the following game from Legion. So really interesting there. Clearly, it was very effective, and I don't think they felt they would be quite as effective with other people. If you're going in the 1v2 matchup, and of course, I mentioned all the supports. To go along with those supports, if you're going against a 2v1, you generally want to go with people with bursts, and that's Graves, Corki, Ezreal, and those are the standard pickups anyway. You don't tend to want to go with the more passive early farmers like an Ashe, like a Kog'Maw. Caitlyn is iffy because Caitlyn's not necessarily going to kill people, but she's going to really poke them down very easily and can push towers really well as well and be very safe while pushing towers. So she's kind of a double-edged sword whether you want her to use her or not. From the 1v2 perspective, you said AP Janna. Malphite does okay with it just because he can build so much defense early on. We've seen Gangplank do really well for SK, and there's a number of other champions that do all right, but generally you want some sort of ranged farm to allow you to pick up some of those minions. Do you have any others in mind, Brian?
Did you mention Cho'Gath? Actually,
I did not mention
Yeah.
Cho'Gath.
Yeah, so Cho'Gath can work well. He can farm well in a 2v1 lane. Yeah, I mean, really the idea is to get more farm than the other bruiser because no matter how good you are at farming, maybe like AP Janna might still be okay, but because AP Janna is ridiculous at farming from range, but really you're gonna get less farm than you would have originally. So you just want to be able to do a better job than your other bruiser that's facing a 2v1 lane as well. Now, if you're doing the switch to mid, might be a little bit different. You want to get more CS than the other mid. So I think, we saw the TF, who had the wild cards to kind of farm up with. So that could work as well. So you really want to try to pick a champion that can do a good job of farming from a distance. And really, Olaf, AP Janna, Cho'Gath, those are really the people who can do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Boy actually did an amazing job 1v2, and it was, I believe it was the first game. It was kind of unfair because he also picked up some early kills and assists, but he did an amazing job actually keeping up with and almost surpassing the AD carry in the 2v1 lanes, which is just kind of unheard of using Olaf. Cho'Gath is good. The problem with melee champions, and Cho'Gath in particular, you don't want to AoE spam down the minion waves, and that's kind of his only option to do it from range, because if you do that, then suddenly you push it back towards the other way, which is bad. And another champion that's been used a lot to varying success, but CLG actually used to use it, was Galio to do the 1v2s. And, again, maybe, he has good range farming, but both him and Cho'Gath, if they get caught out, they are going to die relatively easy in those earlier levels.
Yeah, so it's an important thing to note. But yeah, going in a lane as Cho'Gath or Galio or even Olaf, it might be easier, but it's still not going to be easy. You're going to have to be very careful. The enemy can probably jump on you at any moment, and if a gank comes, it's going to be a 3v1, and you're going to have a very hard time escaping from that. So you're going to have to be very careful and have to be very aware of your surroundings and of your positioning. So it can work out well especially if you're prepared for it with runes and masteries. A lot of people like to run with more armor if they know that they're going to be going up against, for example, if you have a mid going up against a 2v1 with an AD carry, you might want to rune and mastery for more armor rather than for magic resist, as you usually might if you go up against an enemy AP. So those are all things to consider when doing a lane switch. Anything else you want to add, Sotere?
No, I just wanted to agree with your last point. I think we casted the game together when Cruiser the Bruiser from Legion went Malphite, and we were looking at his rune page, and we're like, wait a second, why does he have 35 armor on his rune page? Some ridiculous amount. And we're like, he's going against Vladimir. That's a terrible idea. And we talked about that for a couple seconds, and we're like, wait a second, he must be planning on going bottom. And that's what he did do, and he did a really great job. And I think that was against TSM Evo or some team like that. It might have been MTWNA, because it was definitely against Aframu. But regardless, he did a really good job there. And another important thing for the 1v2 lane is going to give you a huge advantage over the opposing 1v2 lane if you take teleport and they don't, because you don't really have great use for Ignite. I mean, you're obviously going to do a little bit more damage. If a gank comes, you'll be able to help out more there. But you really want to be able to, keep yourself healthy, keep yourself and your mana full, so you can actually continue farming, so you can be safe, and so you can go back and come back to the lane and not necessarily lose that tower right away. And as we saw from CLG, teleport, not a bad skill to have anyway.
Yep, and I think they actually ran it on Sivir as well, so
It did.
Really just not limited to your bruisers or your AP mids. Can even put on your AD carry if you want. So yeah, that's the lane switch. You really want to go in with a plan when you do a lane switch, because you want to plan out where you're going, which champions you're going with, and what runes and masteries, and what summoner spells. So basically, those are all designed to give your team an advantage, and a lot of times we see that it works, and it can even mean the difference between winning and losing a game. So not exactly the most innovative way to change up the meta, but it is one that is being used frequently, so we thought we should mention it and talk about it so that we have an idea of how it really works.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, I don't have any much more to say on it other than the fact that I think more people should try it out. It is a fun little wrench to throw into the plans, and if your team is on board with it, you're going to have an advantage over the other team because they're just going to be confused straight away. Another thing is you have to stick to it. If you want, we saw this actually in the Legion CLG game where they didn't actually want. We kept on thinking, oh, why does Legion want Aurelia 1v2 and they're going against a Vlad 1v2? We thought that wouldn't favor Legion, but they really wanted the matchup and they kept on swapping. But eventually CLG swapped one too many times. Legion gave up at it. But if it's really your plan, you can just keep on swapping, and provided you can clear waves fast and equivalently as fast as the opposing team, then if they teleport back and have to run to bottom lane from top or top to bottom or whatever have you, they're wasting the same amount of time that you'll be wasting. So you can keep even and you can keep the same matchup, but you have to be devoted to it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have teleport because you expected that 2v1 matchup and you want to keep at it, you might even have an advantage in returning to your lanes. So yeah, so that's the lane switch. Remember to tune in next time for another episode of Meta Musings next week, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Fridays. Send in any questions you have to ggcmetamusings@gmail.com. Again, that's ggcmetamusings@gmail.com, and we'll... Yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry. We'll certainly see everyone next week. I just want to say we got actually quite a few emails. We will be getting to those next week.
Yep, so we'll see if we can answer any in our mailbag next week. So stay tuned to that. Thanks for watching the show, and have a good night.
Good night.